Good evening. My name is Marty Schickman. I'm the director for the Center for Jewish Studies at Eastern Michigan University. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's lecture, Holly Huffnagle, After Auschwitz, Anti-Semitism in America. Before the lecture commences, however, I'd like to tell you a bit about EMU Center for Jewish Studies. The CJS offers classes in Jewish life and culture to EMU students, both on campus and on the road, in places as close as New York City and as far away as Germany, Poland, Spain, and Israel. We sponsor faculty and student research, including our remarkable linguistics project, Jewish Life and Language in Southeast Michigan. And we are responsible for a lecture series, which over the years has brought students and community members together to sample latkes for Hanukkah, taste kosher soul food with culinary historian Michael Twitty, dance to klezmer music, laugh at old Jews telling jokes, and sing with Israeli singer-songwriter David Broza. Our next event, celebrating Women's History Month, is on Sunday, March 7 at 3 p.m., when we will welcome Israeli-Palestinian musician Mira Awad for a concert conversation. The event is free and open to the public, so please mark your calendars. None of this is possible without the help from our friends in the community. And if you would like to contribute to our vitally important work, please look to the Eastern Michigan University Center for Jewish Studies page on the EMU website or in Facebook. And if you have any questions, please contact me at, and I do love this handle, jewish.studies@emich.edu. And therefore you don't have to spell my last name. We come together tonight on the eve of Holocaust Remembrance Day, at a time when, unfortunately, our country has witnessed a resurgence and mainstreaming of anti-Semitism. When men in Camp Auschwitz and 6 million were not enough sweatshirts have run wild in the capital of the United States. Our speaker has stood at the forefront in combating such hatred. We could not have put together this lecture without assistance from our friends at the American Jewish Committee, the Jewish Community Relations Council, AJC, the Jewish Federation of Greater Ann Arbor, JCRC, Eastern Michigan University Campus Life, the Harold Grinspoon Foundation, and the fabulous students of Hillel at Eastern Michigan University. I would also like to offer a special thank you to Art and Mary Schumann for their wisdom and guidance in selecting tonight's speaker. If you have questions for Ms. Huffnagle, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your page. And at the end, my brilliant undergraduate, Cole Nelson, will offer questions to Ms. Huffnagle. Now, I have been fortunate to be able to work with a distinguished partner in putting tonight's event together, Rabbi Asher Lopatin of the Jewish Community Relation Council, AJC. And I'd like to ask him to introduce Ms. Holly Huffnagle.
Thank you so much, Professor Schickman. What an honor it is to co-sponsor this event with you, Eastern Michigan University, the Jewish Studies Center. My name is Asher Lopatin, as you mentioned. I'm the executive director of the JCRC AJC. Basically, it's a lot of letters that, first of all, are about relations. And it's the organization in the greater Detroit, Southeast Michigan area that builds relationships with communities beyond the Jewish community and expresses our passions, the passions and the values of the Jewish community to the broader community. So we are so honored to be allowed to co-sponsor this with you and with all the students of EMU. we are also, the JCRC is also AJC. We are the regional office of the American Jewish Committee. And it's going to be so exciting to hear Holly Huffnagle. I mean, it's going to be with trepidation to hear what she says, but it's going to be so important. So we are really honored, the JCRC AJC, to be a combination of this Jewish voice for the broader community and the advocacy efforts of the AJC. Holly Huffnagle serves as AJC's U.S. Director for Combating Antisemitism, spearheading the agency's response to anti-Semitism in the United States and its efforts to better protect the Jewish community. Before coming to AJC, Holly served as the policy advisor to the Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Antisemitism at the U.S. Department of State, and as a researcher in the Mandel Center of Advanced Holocaust Studies at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. She received her master's degree from Georgetown University, where she focused on 20th century Polish history and Jewish-Muslim relations before, during, and after the Holocaust. Most recently, she was a scholar in residence at Oxford University, my alma mater, with the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. I give you Holly Huffnagle.
Thank you, Asher, for the introduction, and Dr. Schickman for welcoming me to speak at Eastern Michigan University this evening. And thank you to everyone for attending this lecture. So the title of tonight's lecture is 75 Years After Auschwitz, Anti-Semitism in America. And I want to start with the very first part of that title. 75 years after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, this hostility toward Jews, not only did not go away, but is rising in Europe, where the Holocaust took place, but also here in the United States. 75 years after Auschwitz, the notorious concentration and death camp complex in German-occupied Poland, 48% of American millennials and Gen Zers cannot name Auschwitz or the name of any other concentration camp or ghetto, a recent survey completed by the Claims Conference revealed. There is a clear lack of awareness today of key historical facts about the Holocaust. For instance, 63% of Americans aged 18 to 39 do not know that 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. And in perhaps one of the most disturbing revelations in this recent study, 11% believe Jews caused the Holocaust. That number jumps to 14% if we just look at how respondents from Michigan answered. 14% of 18 to 39-year-olds in Michigan believe that Jews caused the Holocaust. So we have to think about this when we discuss anti-Semitic attitudes and incidents today. Now, in the last few years, anti-Semitic incidents in the US have risen approximately 150%. We know that incidents in Michigan have doubled between 2018 and 2019, and we're waiting on the 2020 numbers now. Domestic anti-Semitism in general in the past few years has become more violent. It's actually become more open, as illustrated by the massacre in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue in October 2018. This was the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in United States history. And in 2019, Jews were murdered in Poway, California, in Jersey City, New Jersey, and Muncie, New York, simply for being Jews, not to mention the ongoing violence against the Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn, New York. So what is happening and why? Before we answer these critical questions, I think it's really important that we understand the history of anti-Semitism in America, really from the beginning. And the first Jews who arrived in the New World, if you will, came in the 16th century. But it wasn't until the 17th and 18th centuries that small Jewish communities actually formed. And many of them were actually Sephardic Jews who can trace their ancestors back to Spain in the 1492 in the Spanish Inquisition. And by the time of the founding of the United States of America in 1776, there were approximately 2,000 Jews living here in the US. Now, overall, Jews actually found themselves warmly received in their new nation, if you will. And in 1790, President George Washington actually wrote a letter to the Jewish community in Newport, Rhode Island. And he said, "May the children of the stock of Abraham, may you dwell in the land and continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." Now, that biblical reference about sitting under your own vine and fig tree might sound familiar because Amanda Gorman, the youth poet laureate, actually recited it in President Biden's inauguration last Wednesday. It's also really important to note that the advancement of civil equality under the law for Jews following the Revolutionary War helped ensure that government-sponsored anti-Semitism would not take root to the same extent in America as it had in Europe. In addition, the ideological underpinnings of American democracy, combined with the diversity of the American population, also ensured that anti-Semitism would not become as pervasive or as deadly as it had been in Europe. And that's not to say that there wasn't anti-Semitism. It's just in comparison to the European experience. So Jews in America have enjoyed religious freedom and eventually widespread inclusion in American society. And that's really important that we note this first. Nonetheless, the picture has not been entirely rosy. So a few examples. During the Civil War, General Ulysses S. Grant actually ordered the expulsion of Jews from areas of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Mississippi. Thankfully, President Abraham Lincoln rescinded that order. And another example is in 1913, a Jewish man, a Jewish factory manager named Leo Frank, was accused of killing a 13-year-old Christian girl in Atlanta, Georgia, and he was actually lynched after his death sentence was commuted. He was lynched. So when Georgia just elected its first Jewish senator, Senator John Ossoff, earlier this month, this story of that original lynching that happened in 1913 has been, shown again, just because how far the Jewish community in Atlanta has come. That's a positive thing to share. Now, through the first half of the 20th century, Jews faced discrimination in employment. They faced discrimination in housing, membership in certain social clubs and resorts, acceptances into certain colleges and medical schools due to Jewish quotas. And that's important to note. That really was part of the American experience, especially in the first half of the 20th century. Now, probably the strongest period of anti-Semitism in the US was during the interwar period. So there was the Ku Klux Klan, which rose to power in the 1920s. There was also the anti-Semitism of Henry Ford from the great state of Michigan, but he published sections of the anti-Semitic forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a work of fiction that was intentionally written to blame Jews for societal ills. He published this forgery in the Dearborn Independent and actually was one of the greater purveyors of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories during this time. Now, thankfully, the sweeping influence of Henry Ford, but others, such as Father Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest who had a radio program that he would, spread anti-Semitism in the 30s. There was the political anti-Semitism of Charles Lindbergh in the 40s. And of course, there was the Ku Klux Klan. But these voices really did decline after World War II and the Holocaust, as did anti-Jewish sentiment in general. So again, this is that important context that we have to remember when we speak about rising anti-Semitism in America. We acknowledge that the American Jewish experience is really unparalleled in its positivity in the diaspora. And by that, I mean referring to Jewish people living outside of the state of Israel. And yet, here we are. In the last few years, there has been an increase in anti-Semitism, including anti-Semitic hate crimes in the United States. So why is anti-Semitism rising again in America? And why is combating it a problem for non-Jews? And how do we work together to lower levels of anti-Semitism in the US today? So those are our questions. It's no easy task to answer them, but that is the goal of tonight's lecture. So if you'll bear with me, I am going to share my screen. And as you have questions, please continue to to answer or to write them in the chat as we go through this. All right, so let's start this. 1 second. All right, 75 years after Auschwitz, anti-Semitism in America. I want to just have a framework for us to start, kind of what is anti-Semitism, and it's much more complicated as we're about to find out. But anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. And it can, or a hostility towards Jews or discrimination towards Jews. But keep in mind that certain perception part, because we're going to come back to it later on in the lecture. So AJC, the American Jewish Committee, which I have the pleasure of being a colleague of Asher, who introduced me. We are a global advocacy organization. We are headquartered in New York. We're one of the oldest Jewish advocacy organizations in the United States, founded in 1906. We released a report. It was called the State of Anti-Semitism in America report for 2020. This report came out in October, and it was meant to capture like the pulse of how American Jews are feeling about anti-Semitism in America today. So what did we find? We found that nearly 9 in 10 American Jews believe that anti-Semitism is a problem in America today, with 37% saying it's a serious problem. We also found that 82%, 8 in 10 American Jews believe that anti-Semitism has increased. It has risen in the last 5 years. 43% of American Jews say it's increased a lot in the past 5 years. This one is interesting because for the first time, we actually have 2 years of data. So the report we released in 2020, we released a similar report in 2019, and we're actually able to compare. And that's really important with survey data. Numbers on their own are interesting, but when you actually can see if something's getting better or worse, or it's rising or decreasing, that's really important to understanding the issue. So in answer to the question, do you ever avoid certain places, events, or situations out of your concern for your safety as a Jew? In 2019, we found that 25% of American Jews said, yes, I do avoid these places. That number jumped to 31%, almost 1 in 3 in 2020. So we're seeing that rise. We also found that more than 1 in 3 American Jews have been the targets of anti-Semitism, both online and offline, over the past 5 years. This number is actually 37%. So 37% of American Jews have been the targets of anti-Semitism in the past 5 years. The majority of these attacks, or a little more than half of these attacks, have actually taken place online. And I want to spend a second here, because when we think about the future of anti-Semitism, or how to be proactive in the fight against it, we have got to understand what's happening online and on social media and the digitization of anti-Semitism. So we asked American Jews, American Jewish adults, I should note, because I think if I had surveyed American Jewish youth, I think this TikTok number down here would actually be a little bit higher. But we asked American Jewish adults, where have they been targeted by anti-Semitism? And I think it's a reflection of where American Jews are, what platforms they're using. But 62% they had said they experienced anti-Semitism on Facebook. 33% had experienced on Twitter, 12% on Instagram, 10% on YouTube, and 5% on Snapchat, and 2% on TikTok. And I think it's so important to note a couple of things. One is we also found out that 46% of those who had reported this anti-Semitism didn't have their issue addressed. Either the anti-Semitism stayed up or they never received a response. So again, when we're talking about mitigating the problem online, this is something that we need to work better with. Like AJC, for instance, we work with these tech platforms on trying to better understand anti-Semitism and how to enact their policies and community standards. But I want to show you some images online. We're sticking with online for a little bit, and how American Jews are experiencing anti-Semitism online. These are relatively recent images. They have come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think almost all of them, except for the bottom, my left corner, which says the real plague, actually from April of 2020. And what we see here are Jews being blamed for either creating the pandemic, the COVID-19 virus, being the virus themselves. So you can see this in the middle picture. If you like this as someone looking through a microscope and see this Jewish caricature as the virus. Jews are being accused of spreading the virus. There's that Trojan horse picture in the bottom right-hand corner. There's an image of hoping the virus will kill Jews, or kill Israelis. Come on, spread to Israel, as another image. And what's so important, and I can't stress this enough, when we are trying to recognize anti-Semitism today, and I think this is pretty obvious, but it gets a little tricky when things are a little more complex, is the need to understand the history of anti-Semitic tropes. And I think sometimes I teach, I also teach college students, and sometimes when we talk about history, it's like, how is this relevant? But I want to show with two examples why it's so relevant to understand the 2,000-year almost history of anti-Semitism. We're not going to go back 2,000 years, we're going to go back a few hundred. But that's with something called the trope of poisoning the well. So in the same way that we saw Jews being accused of causing COVID-19, of spreading COVID-19, this was not something that the anti-Semites of the 21st century just invented. There's a long history of blaming Jews for poisoning, again, like the well, or trying to intentionally hurt non-Jews. And this is an image, again, from the medieval ages. This has to do with Jews being accused of causing the bubonic plague in the 1300s. And this is the other image is a picture of Jews actually being burned at the stake for this accusation, which of course is a false accusation. So there's a long history here of that trope. That's really important. The other one I want to mention, which I'll show why it's coming up again online, is something called the blood libel. And some of you on this call have probably heard of this trope, but for those who don't know, quickly, it's a accusation that Jews need to use Christian or non-Jewish blood, and it's usually a kidnapping and murdering a Christian child and using that blood for ritual purposes. For example, using it to make matzah for Passover. That was an accusation, and there were many blood libel myths throughout the medieval ages, like the first really in the first real well-documented one in the 12th century in England. And this has been disproven. We know this isn't true, and yet the image, the trope itself, continues to exist, and it's been recycled in different forms. And I'm going to show you an example going right now. This is an image. It's on Facebook. So it's on Facebook. Staying with what's happening online right now, especially. It's someone who's Jewish. You can see that I'm looking at the one on my left with the kind of the bib with the Star of David on that bib. This person is cutting actually a Palestinian child and drinking his blood. The other image is also an image of someone who is identifiably Jewish, drinking Palestinian blood. Now, again, there are many ways to criticize Israeli policy. There's many ways to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Using old anti-Semitic tropes, such as blood libel, is not one of them. And again, when we fight anti-Semitism, we have to be able to note these connections and how anti-Semitism is actually being used in different contexts today. And this is really, really important in understanding what anti-Semitism looks like. So what have we covered really so far? I know we kind of went quickly. We have covered that American Jews think anti-Semitism is a problem in the US. We have discovered that they think that it's rising. We know that many of them experience anti-Semitism online. We've gone through a couple of examples of what some of that anti-Semitism looks like online, but we've still kind of stayed in the realm of how American Jews are feeling about the problem. So one question that I receive in my work combating anti-Semitism is, well, does American Jews' feelings, does it align with the data? What does the data say? And we can definitively say that it does. We know that anti-Semitic hate crimes and anti-Semitic incidents are rising. We have the FBI data. This data you see right here, the 60.2%. This came out just in November of 2020. 2020. So it's for 2019, it's for the year before, but it's relatively recent. So the FBI has found that 60.2% of all religious bias crimes in America target Jews. And Jews make up less than 2% of the American population. So again, they receive the majority of religious bias crimes. I think this next slide is actually really helpful when we think about that trend data. Again, you can look at 2018 for Jewish victims of hate crime, anti-Jewish incidents, and you can see how it's going up in 2019. On average, when you look at these numbers for 2019, it means there's 3 anti-Semitic hate crimes in the United States a day. And again, this is just based on what data the FBI has. We know that there are over 70 cities in America with over 100,000 people who report 0 hate crime. So we know that there's a lot of holes in this data. One thing I should note, though, is that while Jews were the large recipient of anti-religious bias crimes, as far as racially motivated crimes, African Americans were the most targeted group. In fact, with this kind of comparative data, African Americans would have on average 6 hate crimes a day. Jews would have 3 on average a day, and then African Americans would have 6. So that's just to compare. So now we're finally getting to the why. And there is no comprehensive answer to why now, why is this rising, what's happening? But there are several contributing factors. And I think they're all happening at the same time. And it's really the confluence of these reasons. And again, this is not a comprehensive list, but it's a starting point to understand the spike in anti-Semitism that we see today. So the first reason for the rise is rising economic uncertainty. Jews have been blamed for economic woes for millennia. So this isn't new, but really since the recession in 2008, we've actually seen an uptick in economic related anti-Semitism blaming Jews. The second is a lack of confidence in democracy. A lot of these anti-government movements, both on the far right and the far left, who might perceive Jews to be in government. We are noticing some political anti-Semitism coming to the fore. This is the second reason. A third reason for the rise is as an increased emphasis on race and national identity that we have seen in our country. And it's not just in the United States, we've seen this in other countries like such as Poland and Hungary as well. But in the past few years, there has been a growing white supremacist and white nationalist movement in our country. A fourth reason for the rise is a fading legacy of the Holocaust. I opened with some unfortunate statistics about how young Americans understand the Holocaust today. And as we move further away from when it happened, there is a lack of knowledge about where unchecked anti-Semitism can lead. And so, that unfortunately is a contributing factor. A fifth reason for the rise is a deepening polarization between the political left and the political right over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Again, we've seen Jews, American Jews, and we've seen American Jewish institutions targeted as either agents of Israel or Israeli institutions, and it's often not called anti-Semitic. It might be called something else, but we're still targeting Jews here, and that's important to say that's not appropriate. We can't do that and have that kind of conversation. The sixth reason for the rise is the internet and social media. I just showed you just a couple of examples scratching the surface of what we find today online, but the internet has really served as this launching pad for conspiracy theories and lies. Lies spread 6 times faster than truth. All of us who are internet users know that it's anxiety and it's anger and it's fear, that's what's generating the views. And that's a really hard place to fight anti-Semitism, and as it takes on a life of its own. And then the seventh reason, and this is where I want to spend a little time with you, is there are more sources of anti-Semitism today, and I would argue maybe than any other point in history. And that's not, that's just because there are new variations, there are new places it's coming from. We still have the Christian anti-Judaism, from the first century. We still have that today, but we also have new forms and new sources as well. So what do I mean? I have 5 pictures here. You'll probably recognize many of them. They all are from Michigan, but they all represent the different sources of anti-Semitism. So we have the far right, we have the far left, we have Holocaust denial and distortion, we have religious extremist anti-Semitism, we have conspiracy theories, and just gives a small taste of how hard it is to combat anti-Semitism because of its complexity. So I'll start actually just looking at the middle picture. There's a Nazi swastika. I think that's a relatively easier source of anti-Semitism to identify. This is far right. The source is the far right. And this is an image that was found on Temple Jacob in Hancock, Michigan in 2019. And this exemplifies kind of the traditional xenophobic, nativist anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism of the neo-Nazis, of the white supremacists and white nationalists and fascists. And this is also the anti-Semitism that we saw on January 6th at the insurrection in our nation's capital. Dr. Schickman mentioned the Camp Auschwitz t-shirt. There was a Nazi swastika on a flag that was being waved. So this was this source here. But if we look to the picture to, I guess, my right of Governor Whitmer, the sign, which I think maybe you've seen, this is an example of Holocaust distortion. And I can explain the connection here to anti-Semitism. So I would never call this man holding the sign an anti-Semite, but I want to explain how, in effect, this can lead to increased anti-Semitism. So this was the protesting stay-at-home orders in Lansing in April of 2020. And what this sign is actually doing, it's saying that the governor, the governor of Michigan, whose policies one can disagree with, that is absolutely okay. But comparing the governor to Adolf Hitler, and Adolf Hitler, who sought the annihilation of Jews in Europe for being racially impure, for being subhuman, and ended up killing 6 million of them. Making that comparison between Governor Whitmer and Hitler is not only factually wrong, it lessens what Hitler did. And that's the key point. When you lessen the atrocities that Adolf Hitler did, real anti-Semites, they hear that dog whistle. They love that. Like it's exemplifying their leaders being used in the public more. And Jews will actually perceive this as horrific, because you're diminishing the genocide of the Jewish people when images like this appear. So again, that's complicated, but you can see how Holocaust distortion can be a form, or can lead to increased amounts of anti-Semitism. The next picture I want to focus on is the one right above the swastika. This was a rally in, I think I'm pronouncing this right, Macomb County in September, late August, early September 2020. And they're holding a sign saying, save the children, stop pedophilia, which looks normal. But I'm going to explain a little bit about conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism actually playing a role in the majority of conspiracy theories. So in many conspiracy theories, there's a common denominator. It's an evil someone or something in power, exploiting humanity. That's just a common thread through conspiracy theories. There's someone evil in power exploiting humanity. And this is where anti-Semitism comes in. So if there's one thing from this lecture I want you to remember, I think it might be this. Anti-Semitism is different from other forms of racism, which vilify their victims as inferior. And anti-Semitism does do that. It does vilify its victims as inferior, as the far right does. But anti-Semitism is unique because it perceives its target, Jews, as also superior, as having too much privilege, as having too much power, as having too much control. And Jews are actually attacked for that. So they're attacked for both being inferior and for being superior. And that's the conspiracy side of things. That's the irrationality of anti-Semitism. And this blaming of Jews for these two things has, again, that long history. David Nuremberg, he's a historian at the University of Chicago. He actually says that anti-Semitism is part of the grammar of the West. And we see this actually in conspiracy theories today. And this image now, I'll get to the image here in Macomb County in Michigan. is a QAnon rally. And again, the QAnon conspiracy theory, which has gone from the fringes to the mainstream in the last couple of years. And I know they're kind of having a falling out right now after the inauguration, but believed that they were a loose network of far right supporters who believe that there's a deep state, or there was a deep state, or there still is a deep state against former President Donald Trump, and it's controlled. It's the Democrats, it's Hollywood elite, it's the media, and it's Jewish bankers and globalists, and these people in power, and they're running this group is running a sex trafficking ring. Again, they're pedophiles, they're cannibals. It's an illicit sex trafficking ring, and again, the conspiracy theory was that former President Donald Trump was meant to break it apart. It was meant to bring it to light, if you will. So this is an example of the Save the Children, but I wanted to make sure we note that anti-Semitism. It's Jewish globalists, Jewish bankers, the control piece. This is classic kind of protocols of the elders of Zion, that forgery I mentioned earlier, that Henry Ford actually spread here in the United States. It's also a little bit of that blood libel. This idea that Jewish globalists and bankers are actually, working with children, having this illicit sex trafficking ring with children, harvesting children's organs, which was just part of the QAnon conspiracy. So there's a little bit here, and if we don't know this history of anti-Semitism, it's really hard to see the connections in what we're seeing today. So again, going back to the past a little bit. I want to go now to the bottom corner of the screen and talk about a fourth source of anti-Semitism that we see today. And this is anti-Semitism that comes from maybe the broader umbrella category is religious extremism, but really maybe the third biggest threat against Jews is from Islamist extremism, or maybe extremism in the name of Islam. And I want to point to, this is, and again, I'm not going to call the person speaking this language an anti-Semite at all, but I'm going to talk about the act, the language. So this was an image from a sermon that was given at the Islamic Center of Detroit. And the imam is saying that both US presidential candidates are Zionist puppets. And the accusation again of Jews being a puppeteer or a mastermind or having their hands in things harkens back again to that forgery, the protocols of the elders of Zion, this anti-Semitic forgery. And the imam went on to say that all the decision-making in the world was done through Silicon Valley and Israel. So again, the Jewish state is behind all world decisions. So again, this language we've heard used before, but just referred to Jews, and then suggested that there was actually a plot to infect Muslims actually with COVID-19. So again, it's some conspiracy here, but this is an example, I would say, of anti-Semitism coming out maybe in the name of Islam. And we have to be careful with this language, of course, but we still need to call out anti-Semitism and be honest where we see it. The fifth and final photo I want to focus on might be really actually familiar to some of you on this call. The Jewish community of Ann Arbor is on the lecture. This is an example, and again, it kind of crosses with some of these other sources as well of, I would just argue, kind of far left anti-Semitism. This is more when we think about identity-based politics. There is conspiracy thinking here too. This includes tropes of Jewish power, control, Jewish privilege has been a new word that's being thrown around now. Kind of intersects with this, post-colonialism, maybe Israel-related anti-Semitism, anti-Americanism even. And this is something that we're also seeing. And this is hard to pin down. And it's not as obvious as I would say the far right, the swastikas on the side of a temple. But it's important to understand it and how American Jews feel when they see something like this. So this is an example of a protest, an anti-Israel protest, which anti-Israel protests are fine. It's when it's when they become anti-Semitic, or they are targeting Jews as Jews in America and creating a hostile environment. And this was an example of something that's happened here. So this is a protest that's gone on in front of Beth Israel congregation in Ann Arbor. It's gone on for over 15 years. These protesters would stand in front of the congregation and protest as Jews would go to, as the Jews of Ann Arbor, the community, would go to worship. And there's been several lawsuits, but I want to point to this idea of Israel having no right to exist and why that can be anti-Semitic. So what does it mean that Israel, the world's only Jewish majority state, has no right to exist? And I think we have to ask ourselves questions like, what does it mean that Jews don't have a right to national self-determination in their historic homeland? And when you're promoting something like this, what are you saying? So we have to look at the intent of the person. We have to think about this. We have to put it in context. We can't just say, this is automatically anti-Semitism, but it's creating that environment, and it's hurting Jews, and this is why. And I think it's so important when we hear some within the community, especially on the far left and the left, saying that this is not anti-Semitism, is pointing to what the majority of Americans and the majority of American Jews think about this Israel no right to exist language. We asked that question. We asked that question in our survey that we did in 2020. And I should note, I should have started with this, but this was actually the largest sample size that a Jewish organization has ever conducted of American Jews. We had over 1,300 American Jews respond to our survey with a really small margin of error. And to the question, Israel has no right to exist, is it being anti-Semitic? 85% of American Jews said yes. And this was surprising for us, but in a good way. 74% of the US general public also said that is anti-Semitic. So again, those 5 sources are really important when we think about the complexity of anti-Semitism today. So this segues nicely into the final few slides I have for our lecture. Keep thinking of those questions. I see some coming into the chat. Is bringing the American public into the conversation. What does the American public, not American Jews, but what does the general US public think about anti-Semitism in America today? What do they know about it? And how does it compare with how American Jews are answering the question? So in answer to the question, is anti-Semitism a problem in America today? The first line I've already shared, 88%, 9 out of 10 almost, American Jews said yes. 63% though of Americans said yes, which is actually, I was happy with that number, getting this data. I'm like, okay, it's a simple majority, but 63% of Americans say that yes, anti-Semitism is a problem in the US today. Now, interestingly, 33%, 1 in 3 Americans say it's not a problem. And again, well, why is that? And we need to ask those a little bit of those deeper questions. The amount of anti-Semitism in America for the past 5 years has increased, according to 82% of American Jews. That number is half. 43% of the US general public say that it's increased. And on the decreased side, it's 14% of the general public. And it actually means that 57% of Americans say that anti-Semitism has either stayed the same or it's decreased in the last 5 years, which again, we know that's not true. So again, why is it? What's missing? And I think one piece that's missing, and this is this really fascinating piece of information that we were able to find, was a lack of familiarity with the term anti-Semitism. So we found that 21% had actually never heard the term before. 1 in 5 Americans have never heard the word anti-Semitism. And 25% had heard of it, but were unsure what it meant. So really couldn't describe what it was. So again, this is nearly half of the American population who really isn't sure what anti-Semitism is. So this kind of shows the work that we have ahead of us. It's just trying to understand what is anti-Semitism, what does it look like today? And that really leads us into this final segment of our lecture, which was that question, where do we go from here? What can we actually do to combat something that is so complex, seems, is rising? We know where it can lead, those of us who know about the Holocaust. What can we do? And there's a kind of a strategy that many Jewish organizations, but also individuals kind of take on. It's called a multi-pronged approach, this idea that you can't there's no silver bullet to end anti-Semitism, but because it's complex, we can actually take different strategies. And so I've listed some of them here. I won't go into all of them for the sake of time, but one is the defining anti-Semitism segment here, which is really important. AJC, along with over 30 governments around the world, and then the European Commission, and also the UN General Secretary, advocates for the use of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, a working definition of anti-Semitism to help understand what anti-Semitism looks like today. That's a very helpful educational tool. That's really what it is. It's a resource. Education in general about what anti-Semitism is, that it didn't end with the Holocaust, that it continues to today. The data and reporting piece is also really important. I'm on number 4 here. I don't want to skip over security, but that is that really important piece, but it's kind of a band-aid to not getting at the root of the problem as well, is data and reporting. We know that 76% of American Jews who did our survey shared with us that they didn't actually report the anti-Semitism they faced. So they're not, they either, don't think it warrants that level of reporting. So that kind of, it's normalizing the problem, or they don't feel like anything will be done. Like if they report to the police, like nothing would be done. And that really speaks to the kind of the resignation in the fight against anti-Semitism. The 5th piece kind of is legislation, and then there's also advocacy, which is kind of connected. It's really, working with your elected officials, members of Congress, to pass legislation that helps the Jewish community and other minority communities, and other communities under this kind of pressure. The final thing I want to point out, and my time is quickly running out, is building coalitions. And I can't stress this enough, but in the fight against anti-Semitism and in the fight against homophobia, and the fight against Islamophobia, and the fight against racism, this is so important. This building coalitions with non-Jews, Jews and working with non-Jews on this, because the voices are actually much stronger and amplified when non-Jews speak out against anti-Semitism. And there's a really powerful quote by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. He was the former chief rabbi in the United Kingdom, and unfortunately he passed away just a couple months ago at the age of 72. So just too soon. He said that Jews cannot fight anti-Semitism alone. The victim cannot cure the crime. The hated cannot cure the hate. And I think about this, and I'm not Jewish, I work on these issues all the time. I'm always asked if I'm Jewish all the time. Like, you must be Jewish because you combat anti-Semitism. And I like to say, actually, this idea that the hated can't cure the hate. Like, the people who have that certain perception of Jews, or who discriminate against Jews, or who hold anti-Jewish views, are are non-Jews, and we need to be the ones helping responsible to fight anti-Semitism. And I always like to connect the fight against anti-Semitism with like the bigger promotion of what it means to be in America, what it means for our democratic values, for our fundamental rights, that the higher levels of anti-Semitism in a country mean that the society is actually less willing to uphold those values and to uphold those rights. And it's much more about, fostering and nurturing a democratic and pluralistic society when we're fighting anti-Semitism. So that's how I like to think about it. When we're fighting anti-Semitism in America today, we are really fighting for the health, the well-being, the equality, the stability, the depolarization of our society and of our democracy. And I think that's really where I want us to end with, that this is a much bigger picture than just the fight against anti-Semitism, but it's really about our democratic values and what it means to live in a pluralistic society today in America, and preserving that. So at this point, I am going to end, and I want to thank you for your time and attention, and I'm going to turn it back to our hosts for the questions that are coming in, and I'm also going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. That was lovely. A lot of details in there that even surprised me, and I like to consider myself pretty informed on this. As it is a complicated topic, we have quite a few interesting and complicated questions. We're not going to get to all of them, sadly, but hopefully we'll be able to pick some of the best. What I'm going to start with here, you mentioned this briefly. What is the correlation between this rhetoric about the elite of American society? We've seen this increasingly on pretty much all spectrums of the political field, that there is an American elite who's working against the rest of America. And how is that interacting with anti-Semitism and those attacks being directed at Jews or at some perceived elite?
I think in your question, you even hinted at it. It's this idea that, even if it's not overt anti-Semitism, and I wouldn't necessarily say if someone said globalists or elites, I think American Jews hear that and they hear that dog whistle and they think, oh, this is just, but often someone who's saying it doesn't necessarily know that this could be rooted in anti-Semitism. But I think there's some connection here, and it's part of that that grammar of the West piece, that so much of our language and how we describe things and understand things is based on the need to scapegoat, to explain when things go wrong, to build community almost around some, like, you know, blaming a problem on someone else. And for such a long time, that person that receives that blame has been the quote unquote Jew. And I do think that when we refer to elites, and I get it, it's all across the political spectrum. It's on, you know, and at AJC, we do call out anti-Semitism whenever we see it, and that's very important to my work. I think if there was another, you know, adjective, like whether it be like the Rothschild elite or, you know, Soros global, you know, kind of bringing in that Jewish element, that's a little bit more obvious, that anti-Semitism. But I think we'd have to find a little bit more information and in context to determine whether it was anti-Semitic or not. But it's based on that history. Absolutely.
In a similar vein to that question, and I've seen a couple different things phrased differently about this, QAnon, the new rising conspiracy theory group, some people would call it a terrorist organization. It's a very wide and very expansive organization. How would you feel about, are they an anti-Semitic organization specifically? Are they a conspiracy theory group? Where do they fall on the spectrum of all of these things?
It's such a good question. And because they're such a loose network, you know, are there terrorists within QAnon, domestic terrorists within QAnon? Absolutely. Are there rabid anti-Semites within QAnon? Absolutely. Is, like, you know, my husband's grandmother maybe in QAnon? Maybe. Like, you know, it's a range of people. And that's what I would actually argue what's so scary about it, is that it has gone from these fringes. It started on this fringe far right platform. It was called 8chan. It's now called 8kun, where the followers of Q, which refers to this, you know, government source, the secret source, and the Q is like the highest security clearance in the Department of Energy. That's what Q refers to. And Anon just means anonymous. So there you get it, QAnon. They would get these drops of information. They were kind of called breadcrumbs, or these Q drops, and they would follow these clues into the real world and see what this, you know, this was revealing. But I think it took on a new element when it took on campaigns that were already mainstream, like Save the Children. I mean, there's a real campaign for a real need to save children in the United States from sex trafficking. And I think especially within I guess I'll call it my community. I grew up in an evangelical Christian community. I don't necessarily identify with that community right now, but I see the elements. It's very important within that community to fight sex trafficking. And that's a rightful cause no matter what community you're part of. But there were elements that spoke, the language is kind of collided. And you saw that kind of usurping of Save the Children into QAnon. And then you see that being posted by, like, you know, your aunt and your cousin on Facebook. And that's what we have to watch. So and I would actually argue those in the mainstream are less familiar with the anti-Semitic, the roots, like the blaming again of the globalists, the Jewish globalists, the bankers that are, you know, having this sex trafficking ring, and there's not a knowledge of blood libel. There really is, and it's a lot of ignorance. But that's really dangerous, you know, because that's actually what the anti-Semites want. They're getting their message out there. So we'll see what happens to them. Nicole, you know, after the inauguration, I think that I was watching some of their channels and they were kind of unsure what to do next.
Yeah, I think my last question on this, particularly, this kind of harkens back all the way to Charlottesville and the Unite the Right rally.
Right.
Increasingly, we're seeing this in people who look a lot like me, young white men. And it's spreading to people on the internet at increasingly young ages. These ideas through YouTube videos, through various forum channels. How do we stop kids? I mean, I'm going to call them what they are, teenagers,
Right.
From falling down this rabbit hole and this pipeline that seems to lead them to alt-right anti-Semitic groups?
That's exactly what it is. It's a rabbit hole. There's a really good podcast actually called Rabbit Hole about how you start on one platform and how even algorithms on YouTube have actually like basically get you to a point of, oh, you like, just because you like this video, you can watch this one, and you kind of keep on going. And YouTube, we actually know this now, has been one of the biggest instigators. They've gotten better. They've actually now are doing proactively changing you from watching those videos. But for a long time, they were actually leading young white men into these videos in the same way they were leading radicalized Muslims into terrorist content. It was the same kind of algorithm, bringing communities together and kind of creating these kind of pods, if you will. This is so challenging because I think when we think about belonging, I'm actually quite nervous about how young white men in America are going to find belonging today. I think especially because some of the narrative is a little bit anti-white, and you can see kind of why. But what we don't want is to push them, into these groups that are actually saying that there is a white genocide happening, and they go to these sites and they see these numbers, and they see that by 2040 America is going to be 60% black and brown country and 40% white, and then basically they're going to just be declining, and it's fear tactics that are being used on these young minds, and they're not fully formed. And so we have to be really proactive. Community building efforts that are, that really focus on that pluralism, that multiculturalism, that we're stronger in these communities. And I think it's actually really important too with the other minority communities to be welcoming of white men. Like we really need to right now, and not to isolate or to turn away. And in the same way, I think that they're receiving a lot of this, and something we don't talk about actually a lot in the anti-Semitism, combating anti-Semitism space, but talk about social media platforms. We don't talk a lot about online gaming. And gaming, that's unfortunately a big space where it's pulling young men into these unfortunate corners. And so I think if we can create games that are actually doing the opposite, that will also be a step in the right direction. But this is the question of our time, I think, Cole, you just asked.
So we've got a question that's been worded pretty much the same question in a couple different ways, and I think this is something a lot of people wonder about. As you mentioned in your lecture, Jews are often attacked not for being the lessers in society, but for being the higher up. How
Right.
does that interact with white privilege? Many Jews, unless they choose to identify themselves in varying ways, based on their attire, if they wear, jewelry, anything like that, can pass as white and thus gain a lot of privilege from that. How does that interact with anti-Semitism from the day-to-day life? And how does the ability to pass both as one of the most privileged in America, as well as being one of the most attacked in America, how do those two things interact with each other?
You nailed the complexity of anti-Semitism. And it's important to note that and many, basically, Ashkenazi Jews who are white presenting or white facing Jews who I work with, even at my organization, do acknowledge that they have benefited from being able to pass as white. Now, they do harken back to an earlier time when I mentioned it in the lecture about the quota systems, about Jews not being allowed to go to certain clubs or own these certain businesses, and there really was kind of institutional anti-Semitism in America, absolutely. But it's this, when you compare what's happening now, I think, for instance, to the fight for racial justice in our country, you don't necessarily have that same comparison. I think what's challenging, there's a couple of challenging things. The first is, and something I've seen, at least on the far left, and maybe far left, there is not as much of an acknowledgement or an awareness or at least an admittance, I don't even know what to call it, of that Jews, I mean, maybe in America, the majority are white, but as far around the world, Jews are black, they're brown, they're Mizrahi, they're Sephardic, there are color, I don't want to call them like necessarily Jews of color, but there needs to be recognition that Jews are not a monolith. And so that's part of the conversation, and something that we need to present better in America. We need to present better the diversity of Jewish life. I think it's also, though, important to continue to bring up the fact that when we look at what happened in Pittsburgh, when we look at what happened in Poway, these are far right incidents. They really go through the white supremacist manifesto, and Jews are seen by white supremacists as trying to be white, and therefore they're the targets of that hate and murder. So. At the same time, I think it puts us in a challenging space to have a kind of a competition of suffering, or compare what one group is, how is my suffering compared to what, African Americans are going through right now? That's challenging, but I do think it's important to acknowledge that the suffering of the other. And just because someone who's Jewish is white passing, we don't begin to scratch the surface of maybe what they're facing in other spaces. And so that's really important, and something I've learned actually as someone who isn't Jewish, working with Jews who might look like me, and actually realizing how they've been discriminated against in various spaces. So it's part of the conversation, definitely.
So another question that we've gotten a couple times, and I think this is a little bit more of something that a lot of people, probably a lot of Americans, you mentioned your numbers about how all of America feels about this. The term anti-Semitism, where did that come from? What does that really mean? And why, we have a couple questions. Why not use the terms anti-Jewish or, Jewish hate crimes? Why do we use this term anti-Semitism, and how does that affect the way most of America views this?
This is a great question. And I would actually, I always like to open the answer to this question, because I have received it before by saying, I don't know if it helps our case that the term anti-Semitism was actually coined by an anti-Semite, because it was. So the term anti-Semitism comes from Germany, comes from the turn of the 19th century, so late 1800s. A man named Wilhelm Marr. He was a German publicist. He was a self-proclaimed anti-Semite. He created the League of Anti-Semites, and it was something to be very proud to be an anti-Semite. It was basically fighting against Jewish emancipation in Germany. He wanted to protect the jobs of German non-Jewish Germans. So created this term anti-Semite. The challenge here is actually, and why I still appreciate using this term anti-Semitism is it's kind of become, I was gonna say, some people say for worse, but I actually think it can be for better, an umbrella, like this catch-all. So it's a new term, it's a modern vintage, but we're now using it to scholars too, not just practitioners, to look at anti-Semitism really from the time of Jesus Christ to, really that anti-Judaism that came out of, unfortunately, interpreted out of some of the Gospels, through the divisions between, Judaism and Christianity into the medieval ages, and into the political and socioeconomic anti-Semitism, to the racial anti-Semitism, into the anti-Semitism now that somehow brings in the Jewish state, like these different kind of levels. Anti-Semitism, the term kind of is covering that. And I think why it's still important not to say anti-Jewish hatred or anti-Judaism or these kinds of things, is because that still refers to that hatred or that discrimination or that inferiority. And I think when we talk about anti-Semitism as that certain perception, that allows us to talk about that other piece, that tropes of assailing Jews for their superiority, that power, that control, that conspiracy piece. And that's missing when we say, anti-Jewish hatred. Because and I'll end with this. I was engaging with someone online, someone who had said something very anti-Semitic about Jews controlling the world and running the banks, and I said that as an anti-Semitic. And this person said back to me, I don't hate Jews. I don't hate Jews. I'm not an anti-Semite. I don't hate Jews. I love Jews, and I'm thinking, like, this is the problem. When we say anti-Jewish hatred, people are thinking that it's just hate, and it's actually much more than hating. Yeah. Great question.
So I've got one more for you, and hopefully this has been important and a lot of really useful information, but it's heavy. And I think it weighs heavy on a lot of our hearts to hear how people think about this. So a little bit more of an uplifting question at the end. We've got a lot of people who, as noted in the lecture, have never heard of this. How does the general American public educate non-Jewish children, non-Jewish adults about anti-Semitism, about the Holocaust, about what's going on now, and make them care about something that is deeply important, but won't affect them in their everyday life, really? How do we spread that into the mainstream kind of lexicon and teach people about these things?
Yeah, this is a question we ask ourselves every day. I think you hit it at the very end. It's this, if it doesn't affect them, like, why would they care? And I think that's the question that's what we have to present this topic. This does affect you. And this is how, I mean, people should obviously care about because it's another person, but like, I think when we do connect the fight against anti-Semitism, and again, like the hated can't cure the hate, it's those of us who have the issue. And we put it in terms of broader, you know, human decency almost. What does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be, you know, living in a pluralistic country? What's the bedrock of our society? And when levels of rising anti-Semitism, or when anti-Semitism is rising, that actually is a barometer of the health of our society. And again, it's speaking into what as Americans we really care about, and whether it be freedom of religion, you know, freedom, or safety, security. Like, so there are ways to bring it in. And, you know, I think too, there is just a lack of understanding. I mean, I grew up in a Christian home, and I was not aware of, and just speaking personally here, I was not aware of the 2,000 years of Christian anti-Judaism, which set the stage for the Holocaust, until I was in college. And that was a wake up call for me. Think, well, as a Christian, I mean, there's something I kind of want to give back to this. This is what happened. So there is that ignorance there, which I think is really important. But I think there's examples that we need to go back to and we need to model. And maybe this is before the age of the internet, but one example that we like to share at AJC, and this is something that I think can begin to speak to rebuilding communities and rebuilding civility and civil discourse and knowing our neighbors, which I think we're actually losing. And I think this actually is connected to the fight against anti-Semitism. There was there's a really incredible, powerful story that came out of Billings, Montana in the mid 90s. And there was an anti-Semite who threw a rock into a house, a Jewish house. There was a menorah in the window, and the rock went right through the window, and it crashed right by the floor of a sleeping child. If it was any closer, it could have hit and maybe killed the child. The response of the neighbors, there was actually a menorah that was printed in the newspaper. The public, and in this town, Billings, Montana, it's mostly 90% Christian. And all of a sudden you have neighbors cutting out that menorah and putting it in their window. And you have some of these anti-Semites starting to throw rocks in their windows, but pretty soon it was too much. Like, there were too many neighbors, like non-Jews, putting menorahs in their window to basically sending that message, like, you're not wanted here. Like, you know, we care about our neighbor. And I think that's something that we need to kind of return to as a society. I don't have an answer of how we do that instantly, but there are people that are thinking about ways that we can do it, even through virtual, even through an internet campaign, using the internet for good. But that's where I think we need to go, honestly, in this fight.
Well, I certainly think tonight this lecture was a great way to start with educating people and teaching them how to love one another in a pretty scary time. So thank you for that. I'm going to pass it back over to Marty.
Hi, Holly, thank you so very much for this evening. It was a remarkable lecture. And one of the things about speaking to the audience at Eastern Michigan University is that you are speaking to a very, very mixed audience. We are the most, I believe, diverse state university in the state of Michigan. And I think this was really healthy for our audience, and it was certainly healthy for me. And I can't even begin to thank you enough. And you're fabulous. And I want to thank the AJC. I want to thank Ashley Patton. I want to thank Art and Mary Schumann again, and all of our friends, and all of you who came this evening. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me at jewish.studies@emich.edu. For those of you who inquired as to whether or not this will be posted, whether this lecture will be posted, it will. It will take us about 2 weeks. EMU will be adding closed captioning to the lectures, so it becomes more accessible, and we do care deeply about accessibility. And we'll be posting it. And I'm so moved and so thankful. And Holly, Asher, thank you both so much. It's been a wonderful evening. I'd like to thank all of you who came tonight. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Please be safe out there. The world is dangerous for so many reasons. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night. Thanks so much, Marty.